Everybody. Hello. Thank you for watching us. This is Ahmed Bening, our friend from Africa and the acting Secretary General of the Pan-African Youth Union. Thank you for agreeing to join us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you end up in youth politics?
Okay, so thank you, Valeria. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to engage with young people of Russia. Russia is home to me, like you know, and it's always a great delight having an opportunity to engage with young people of Russia. Just a quick background. So I come from Ghana, the Republic of Ghana in West Africa, and I've been a student activist from my secondary school days, which we call the high school. Back in high school, I had the opportunity of leading the students as a prefect, as we call them, in my high school. And so my youth leadership career actually took off from high school when I had an opportunity back then in my very early ages to be a prefect back in school. When I completed and then I got back home from secondary school, I lived in a rural community, not a very large city. And so it was important that when you were educated and then you had some amount of education, you are able to rally young people around one common cause. So back from school, I had an opportunity then to work with civil society organizations, community-based civil society organizations around community development matters. And then for a year, I got into the university. And when I got into the university, it became a learning platform for me and a learning curve, if you want to put it that way. In second year, I had an opportunity of being elected to the National Executive Committee of the National Union of Ghana Students. And I schooled very far away from Accra, 16 hours from the capital city. So to have an opportunity to serve on the National Executive Committee of the National Union of Ghana Students was a privilege for me. And I tried to do the best I could in service to front. I remember it was tough because then I had to be in school at the same time carrying out my assignments as a member of the National Executive Committee. When I finished my term, it was a one-year term. I had an opportunity of serving with the All Africa Student Union, which was a continental student body on the African continent. That's gave me a lot of platform and leverage to contribute significantly to youth and student politics across the African continent. So from 2010, I was at a continental level with the National Students Unions. In 2013, I became the Secretary General for the West Africa Youth Organization, which is also the sub-regional youth organization for West Africa. And I think I served quite well. So it caught the attention of other organizations that thought that I did well and I needed to work with them. Whilst there, I had an opportunity in 2010 to be on the International Organizing Committee for the World Youth Festival that was hosted in South Africa. And so I lived in South Africa for about 3 months, organizing events toward the World Youth Festival. And I think that actually gave me a lot more exposure because I had an opportunity to work with all categories of young people from across the world. And I remember at the time we were able to mobilize 127 countries, 20,000 young people from across the world to South Africa. And we had a fantastic festival. Fast forward, it became Ecuador 2013. I had an opportunity to travel to all the IPMs in India and in South Africa and across. So I had an opportunity to serve on all these platforms. And I think that's what actually gave me the drive to move on to the Pan-African Youth Union, because I thought that I had some experience and exposure and some technical know-how, because I'm a development person by training. And I felt that bringing this experience and exposure and the network that I had would be important to drive that development agenda on the African continent. So this is what actually triggered my getting into the Pan-African Youth Union. And Valeria, as you know, before my coming into the Pan-African Youth Union, I had an opportunity then to have served on Russia 2017 International Organizing Committee. And for those of you that we worked with when we were in Russia, I think that we did a fantastic job. It gave us an opportunity for us to cooperate with the Russian Federation and the young people of Russia, have a better understanding of Russia. I must add, I came into Russia in 2017 and I saw a very liberal, open-minded Russia. I came across fantastic young people like you, the President Grigory, the Valeria, and so many other young people that paint an extremely different picture from what we knew. And so when I got back from Russia to Africa, I became a mini ambassador of Russia. And I was like, no, Russia is an open, liberal country. And I think that African young people will be a fantastic opportunity for them to begin to understand how Russia operates and how far they have come. So this is in brief my journey over the last 10 years.
Thank you. By the way, would you say that most Africans think that Russia is a communist country? Is it a general stereotype?
I think yes. I think a lot of countries still look at Russia as a Soviet state. And that before I came to Russia in 2017, I equally had it at the back of my mind that Russia was a communist state and Russia was a very closed state and a totalitarian state. When I got to Russia in 2017, I think that I had a new perspective of Russia because I had an opportunity of moving around Russia. I stayed in Moscow for more than a month before moving to Sochi. I engaged a lot of Russians that were willing to interact with the rest of the world. And it's interesting to recognize that even when you met young Russians and you talked about communism, it was like you were in the 1900s because they had a whole different mindset. And Africans, majority of African countries, because of the kind of history that they had with the Soviet Union, still view Russia in that perspective. Remember that the Soviet Union played an extremely important role in the liberation struggle across the African continent and receiving a lot of Africans into Russia, providing a platform for them and supporting the militant arms of these political parties to liberate themselves from colonialism. So yes, that history is what we know. And that's why I keep encouraging a lot of young people to engage Russia, travel to Russia, get an opportunity to see the new Russia. And I'm excited to be part of the groups of young people that are beginning to see that new Russia. And I think that it's a fantastic experience.
Yeah, and I also believe that us Russians should visit Africa more, should travel around and to see that I'm pretty sure that many of the stereotypes they have about African countries will be broken.
Sure.
Moving on to our next question. Yes, moving on to our next question, could you tell us a little bit about youth policy implementation in Africa? Is there some kind of a specific youth policy on the continental level, or is it just on the national level, or how does it work?
Okay, so yes, let me say that Africa is made up of 55 countries. And each of these 55 countries are autonomous sovereign countries. However, we have a regional body, as you know, called the Africa Union. The Pan-African Youth Union is the youth coordinating institution on the continent. In 2006, we had the Africa Youth Charter that was adopted. And that youth charter became the regional or the African policy document that each country was supposed to domesticate. Now, all the 55 African countries were supposed to sign on to the Africa Youth Charter, and that Africa Youth Charter was supposed to be a guiding document or a binding document for the kind of youth policy and youth development paradigm that we wanted to see from 2006 onwards. If you recall, in 2016, we had a review, an analysis, a retrospect analysis of that document in Banjul, Gambia. Now, that document was supposed to be one that provided direction. It was a blueprint for countries to use as a basis to build their national policies. Now, this Africa Youth Charter wanted to do a few things. That document is what we deem as the blueprint or the continental policy of youth. And every other country actually pick that document and then domesticate it. A lot more countries have developed national youth policies outside that blueprint, and I can speak for Ghana and many more countries. Ghana developed a national youth policy out of the Africa Youth Charter. Even though we are signatories to the Africa Youth Charter, we decided to reduce it to meet the aspirations of the young people of the Republic of Ghana. That meant that we identified the real strategic interests and aspirations of the young people of Ghana and tailored it along the continental blueprint. Now, for us as the Pan-African Youth Union, one of our core responsibilities is to ensure that every single country on the African continent, one, signs to the Africa Youth Charter, two, rectifies it. And when we say rectify, when you sign it, it doesn't become a document, a working document. Yes. You present to the parliament of your country. Your parliament goes through it and accept it as a legal document of which young people can hold the state accountable based on what they have agreed to. So all countries that have signed and ratified that Africa Youth Charter, it now becomes an obligation, it becomes a binding of that state to execute youth development in accordance with what we collectively agree as the African continent. Now that brings the regional integration or the regional strive for a homogeneous development system onto the table. And so for us, I insist that countries that have signed must rectify, and countries that have rectified must have that coherence in youth policy. And for countries that have signed to the Africa Youth Charter but do not have national youth policies, because the Africa Youth Charter insists that every country must develop a national youth policy. That's the document that we have used as a working document on the continent. And so far, so good. I think that most countries have developed working documents out of it.
And as far as I know, there's also a youth representative from the African Union to the UN. Is that correct?
Yes. So what happens is that, yes, but you know, every country, depending on the understanding of how the UN system works, is supposed to have youth delegates to the UN. And those youth delegates have time periods. And it's the responsibility of a country to delegate a young person that has a clearer understanding of how international development works and how multilateralism operates, so that they can then repay the aspirations of the young people on their continent at the UN level, and then vice versa.
Okay. Is the Pan-African Youth Union involved in selecting this representative?
No, those are autonomous country-specific decisions. It rests with countries to decide that these are the categories of young people that we want as representatives of our country.
Yes, I just wanted to sum up. So there is some kind of a youth policy coming from the continental level, from the African Union, and the policy document that you have. And then the countries are implementing youth policy on the national level through the ministries of youth, right?
Yes, yes. Now, remember that as part of the Africa Youth Charter, every country is supposed to have a national youth council, because it's a requirement by the Africa Youth Charter.
Is it an NGO?
Now,
is it an NGO or a governmental body?
So we have two categories of structures. Most national youth councils are non-governmental or civil society organizations formed by the young people themselves, made of different categories of young people. Some countries have decided to have the hybrid kind of national youth councils because of the funding and accountability systems by their governments. So you'd realize that in some countries, the board that is made up of young people that do not have a relationship with the government, but they are technical people that manage the funds and resources of the National Youth Council. The National Youth Council, some of them are fully civil society or non-governmental organizations, whereas others are a hybrid. It's a combination of the two because of the kind of funding that they have from the government. So you'd realize that those National Youth Councils that do not have any funding from government and their civil society, they are less effective in terms of movement because you need funding to mobilize young people. But also the Africa Youth Charter is crafted in such a way that governments must make some financial commitments to these national youth councils to allow them to operate. But of course, while that is the ideal thing to do, there's always politics in most countries. And once the national youth councils do not agree with a certain government, the leadership of national youth councils have issues with a certain government, of course, governments will always try to starve them of resources, which has been one of the biggest challenges that national youth councils confront. Because quite a number of national youth councils on the continent then have young people that want to hold governments accountable and want to hold government responsible for ensuring that the development is executed in a particular way. And in most cases, when you begin to hold governments accountable and point out issues of corruption and issues of youth unemployment and inequalities, governments don't take it kindly. So, of course, they try to starve you of resources so you can tone down. They must have the right to address and speak to the issues. And governments should not suppress young people because they raise their voices to request the needed development and the needed accountability to the young people and to the entirety of their countries. So these are challenges that exist, and we have been working in tandem with this National Youth Council to address them.
Okay, thank you. Ahmed, we have received a question from one of our followers. A question to you. What is the gender distribution of young people involved in youth policy in your country? For example, among members of the organizations where you were members?
Okay, so that's a very huge question. First, let me say that gender equality is an important element in development, and we must all strive to ensure equality. However, there are challenges when it comes to the gender equality issues in terms of the leadership and then those that steer the affairs. But in terms of the general contribution to youth policy, I think that there's an appreciable gender balance in doing that. A couple of national youth councils on the continent that are being led by women. Like if you take the National Youth Council of Cameroon, the chairperson of the National Youth Council of Cameroon is a lady. If you take the National Youth Council of Botswana, the chairperson of the National Youth Council of Botswana is a lady. The CEO for the National Youth Council of Seychelles is a lady. The Secretary General of the National Youth Council of Senegal is a lady. The chairperson for the board of the National Youth Authority of Ghana is a lady and a young parliamentarian. The vice president for the National Youth Council of Congo DRC is a lady. And so there are so many instances that we can mention that women are at the forefront of this decision making in countries. And we keep encouraging that a lot more women be given an opportunity to serve at these levels.
Okay, thank you so much for your response. And right now, the whole world is struggling with the pandemic, COVID-19, and it came to Africa a bit later than the rest of the world. I think we can say that. Can you tell us a little bit more what is happening right now in Africa with the COVID? Are all countries in quarantine right now? How are you handling it?
Okay, so let me say that I think that the world needs to give Africa some bit of credit in terms of how we are handling COVID-19, because
Sure, but we
Africa,
need to know more about it.
has handled the COVID-19 better than most European countries, including the Americas, in terms of how we have handled the issues of COVID-19. In Ghana, for instance, yesterday the president declared that he had lifted the lockdown, so there's no lockdown in Ghana. And so just yesterday, because based on scientific data that the president put out there, suggests that yes, we have about 1,000 cases in Ghana. The recovery rates are also very high, and 98% of those that have been infected by the virus are asymptomatic. Based on that data, the country like Ghana decided that, look, we are lifting the lockdown, but we are insisting that there's a ban on public gatherings, and schools are still closed, and people must observe the precautionary measures that have been put out there by the World Health Organization. If we take all the countries, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Mauritius, and the rest, we are going strictly by the guidelines of the World Health Organization. And I think that the contact tracing and testing has been something that African countries have taken seriously, and the education is going down well. What is troubling for us is the fact that people outside the African continent are already preaching doom for us, telling us that there will be dead bodies on the street and people are going to die in huge numbers. We don't think so. We don't think that that's going to happen. We think that the governments are confronting this issue. And I think that policymakers at the multilateral level must stop this fear mongering. Because if even they have data that suggests that, yes, the next epicenter would be Africa, I think that it's important for African countries and then these technical or research institutions to share data and information and strategies on how to curb the doomsday prophecies that they are putting out there. But I can tell you that Africa would get out of coronavirus strong and healthy. We understand there's a global pandemic, yes. We understand that it's a global crisis, yes. But countries have different strategies of addressing coronavirus. I'll give you quick statistics. I was reading through an article that says that in the United States alone, every year between 29,000 and 59,000 people die out of flu. Not the same in Africa. When Africans have flu, they don't die because they have flu. And we don't die because we have malaria. Now, so if corona is in, and then we are all trying to address the challenge of corona, our expectation is that our government, yes, would insist that every citizen goes through, adheres to the protocols of safety precautions. One second, our governments currently are moving to expand the health infrastructure in countries in order to contain the coronavirus pandemic. We don't want it to end with corona. We want it to continue because that is a requirement. And as per the targets of the SDGs, we need more health infrastructure. When it comes to issues of social distancing in specific countries, like in Ghana, for instance, that issue has been raised. In Nigeria, in Kenya, and a few other African countries where they are saying that citizens will not observe the protocols of social distancing. Yes, we agree. But I think that relatively, if you look at the incident and the mortality rate, and then the rate at which it's spreading, I think that we can scale up on the actions that have already been put in place so far to ensure that we do not have the catastrophe that people are envisaging that would strike Africa.
Okay, and another question that we received from the viewers regarding COVID is how do young people fight the coronavirus in Africa?
I think that the fight against coronavirus is similar across the world. Young people are volunteering to educate using social media and then staying at home. Young people have volunteered to work with relief agencies in an attempt to distribute aid to the vulnerable. And so young people, country-specific actions can, for instance, if we come to Ghana, young people have been part of teams that were sharing food to the vulnerable groups of people, sharing PPEs, mobilizing themselves into groups to educate communities on how to keep up with the safety protocols that the World Health Organization has kept up there. But I think that fundamentally, young people have proven that they're having a clearer understanding of the threats of COVID-19, and they are staying at home, and everybody is preaching precaution, which is a fantastic step for us all. Yes, there are challenges of PPEs across the world, and that is the responsibility of government. But I believe that if you take a country like Ghana, where we have decided to produce our own PPEs, most of the industries that are producing the PPEs are being run by young people, and that by itself is a commendable milestone.
Thank you so much for sharing this valuable, insightful information, because it's really hard for everybody to keep up with the news, with the reality, to know what's happening in Africa, because it's not something that we see in the media a lot. So thank you a lot for sharing. Speaking of Russia-African relations, you already touched upon this subject and mentioned some facts about the history, how the Soviet Union helped the liberation of Africa and so on. I would like to come back to this subject. How many times have you been to Russia?
I think I've been to Russia a couple of times. I think I've been there like 4 or 5 times.
So what was your first impression?
Like I said, fantastic, because I came to Russia with my own mindsets and what I'd read and heard about. I remember when I landed in Russia the first time, I expected to be confronted with very cold people that didn't like black people, which was completely different from what I experienced. I expected to see a colloquial Moscow, Russia that had Soviet era infrastructure. But when I came there, I think it was different. I saw a modern Russia. I remember when we went to Moscow City, we worked from the World Trade Center, and you could realize that there was a lot of infrastructural development across the entire Russia. I had an opportunity of visiting St. Petersburg, going to Sochi and a few other cities, and fantastic. So I think that the impression that I got was that Russia was moving toward modernity and had moved away from the Soviet era kind of perception that we had of the Russian Federation. I think that it's a fantastic place that everybody must visit.
Thank you. What are the 3 things that Russians and Africans have in common, and 3 things, like 3 main differences between us?
That's a tough one. I think quite a number of African countries politically have always been in tandem with Russia in terms of, like I said, there's a history. So if you take South Africa, Angola, Zimbabwe, Congo DRC, countries like Ghana and so many others, there's a historic relationship between us and Russia. So politically, we tend to gravitate toward Russia in a couple of issues. In terms of some other things that we both are confronted with is about the global or the world order that we've all been trying to confront, where both Russia and majority of Africa feel that we are being classified more as not being part of the drivers of the global system, which is a little bit difficult, because if you look at where we are coming from, I think that Russia doesn't have the same background. Africa is coming from a background of like 500 years of colonialism, and then you get, when countries are independent, you then need to struggle to be recognized as sovereign state and with equal opportunities at the multilateral decision-making table, especially at the UN level. And of course, that then compels some African countries to want to build some closer relationship with Russia, China, and a few other countries. But in terms of development, I don't think that, I think that there's a lot that we need to learn from Russia because of also the history of Russia and where Russia has got into. African countries would have to learn a few lessons from that, and that sense of resilience and tenacity that the Russian Federation is stood up to all the odds against them over the years. These are lessons that I think that we must be in a position to learn and then realign the kind of relationship that we have across the world. And personally, I believe that African countries must have or must look at the kind of relationship that we have with countries, especially bigger countries like Russia, the United States, and European countries. You gravitate toward France so much so that the development systems are being dictated by France. And if you're colonized by the Portuguese, you tend to gravitate toward them. But in the 21st century, when all countries are independent, I think that countries need to look out for what is in their interest and build partnership and relationship with countries like Russia that never colonized Africa, but have got the technology and technical know-how to help us develop, one, our natural resources, two, our infrastructure, which is what we have been saying, to say, look, we've stayed with these other countries, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Portuguese, for too long a time. It's time for us to put all the big players around the table, Russia, China, the United States, everybody around the table. And the fellow that brings the best bargain, we tend to build those relationships and synergies with you, which is what I believe in.
Thank you. What do you think are their main challenges of Russia-African relations, and how can young people and youth NGOs of Russia and Africa contribute to strengthening our relations?
I think that the relationship between Russia and Africa has been very far away from the normal, ordinary citizens on the ground. It's been at a very political level. The relationship between African countries, like I said earlier, has been at a very political level, and it started at the colonial era, graduated into the Cold War era, and so you realize that relationship became more of a relationship of convenience for geopolitical advantage. The Cold War is virtually non-existent, even though there's a new dimension of the Cold War out there. However, I think that the relationship between African countries and then move beyond the politics and come to economic, and this economic relationship is what is going to attract the normal citizens to the Russian Federation. And China is proving that they moved the relationship between China and Africa to develop infrastructure and exploit the natural resources of the African continent. That kind of relationship is what is going to trigger a new kind of relationship between the African citizens and the Russian Federation, because everything that would inure to the welfare of the ordinary citizen zeroes are down the economy. So Russia has a technical know-how. Russia has an advanced IT capability that we all know about. How does that translate into us extracting our natural resources and using it to the benefit of African countries and vice versa? I think that is what is going to define the kind of relationship that we have with Russia. As young people want to see a new kind of relationship. I believe that, like you said, the reason young Africans see Russia as comparable to the Soviet Union is because that is the history we know. But once we begin to have that socio-cultural engagement and interaction between our youth organizations, within our civil society organizations, it changes mindsets, it portrays that new Russia. So the relationship should transcend politics. The relationship that we envisage as Africa is a new kind of partnership and relationship that moves away from just the normal political class engagement or the elite class engagement.
Yes, thank you so much for your perspective. There's a question from our audience asking what joint youth projects are in prospect between Africa and Russia. And while you're answering, I would like to remind our viewers that they can ask their questions below, and we will have about 5-7 minutes for Ahmed to answer your questions. Okay, so please type your questions, yes, and we will come back to them in the end of the interview. Okay.
I think that I think that if you remember, last month we had a bilateral meeting. One of the things that we wanted to do, to create a platform where young Russians and young Africans can get to engage at that level of exchanging ideas, views, opinions, and technical know-how. When it took place, it was an exciting one because it is going to define the kind of relationship and understanding that both African countries and the we can redefine our relationship moving forward. And that relationship that we talk about shouldn't be defined by just our government. It should be defined by the young entrepreneurs in Russia that have an understanding of the natural resources in Africa and how young people in Africa can partner with this crop of young people in Russia to drive development. So the Russia-Africa Youth Summit is one fantastic thing that we are looking at. The second activity that we agreed on when the Russian National Youth Council visited was for us to create a platform for all young people across the world to meet on a regular basis to discuss on matters of development. So I think that these are excellent activities that have been outlined, spearheaded by the National Youth Council of Russia that we can all hook onto.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. What future do you see for African youth?
I'm saying that it's an exciting future for us as African youth, an extremely exciting one because our numbers are increasing. If you know that Africa is at a point where we have so many young people on the continent, it comes with these challenges. But Africa is a continent with enormous natural resources. In fact, about 35% of all the essential natural resources that's needed for global development is found here on the African continent. This exciting future is anchored on the kind of relationship that we build with the rest of the world, and that includes the young people of Russia. We do understand that Russian youth have got that sense of ingenuity and a lot of technology and capacity out there, and it's important for us to recognize, be it Russia or any part of the world, that African countries are not going to put our resources and our skills on a silver platter like it happened 500 years ago when the colonialists came. We are going to want to address and deal with our colleagues out there as compatriots on the basis of mutual respect and benefit. So it's an exciting future for us, and I know that there are so many African young people that have got the capacity, the technical know-how, and the skill and passion for Africa that are willing to partner with any group of people or persons that have Africa at heart and are willing to deal with us on the basis of mutual respect and on a win-win basis. So it's an exciting time for Africa.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Really interesting perspective. And we have another question for you. How does the multinational corporations benefit the local service providers like farmers who do not have such access or platforms?
I think, let me say that Africans have been exploited by these multinational corporations for far too long. If you look at all the multinational corporations that have come here, whether be to exploit our natural resources in terms of gold, diamond, oil, and gas, the biggest people that have been most disadvantaged as a result of their activities have been those in the rural areas. Now, that's why I'm saying that this is a new Africa, and young Africans are going to stand up and begin to demand greater accountability and corporate social investment in our communities. As it stands now, if you look at the ratio, the rates of profits and resources that have been taken out of the African continent vis-a-vis what kind of corporate investment they make in the communities where the resources are. I think that is negligible and non-existent. And it is because leadership have been complicit in this rape and exploitation of African citizens. But that's why I said in my earlier response that it's an exciting time. Africans are beginning to wake up. Young Africans are beginning to have a clear understanding of what is required of us. And we are going to get out there and demand that.
Okay, thank you. And while we're still waiting for more questions, I have my question for you. Which one of the 17 SDGs, or maybe several, are most relevant to young people in Africa?
I think that literally every SDG there is relevant to us because the issues of poverty, equality, hunger are issues that are relevant to us. In terms of how we push for our governments and for state parties to implement and execute them, it's one thing that we need to address. But I can tell you for a fact that be it peace and security, be it gender equality, be it hunger, be it eradication of poverty, all these are essential and all are equally beneficial in terms of creating the human development and welfare that we require on the African continent.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Please tell us about the volunteer movement in Africa. In your opinion, is this a popular social phenomenon in Africa? Does government support it systematically?
Okay, so let me start from the last bit of the question. Governments do not support volunteer movements systematically. And I think that is the same across the entire world, because to volunteer, it means that young people have identified that there are peculiar challenges within communities and societies that they need to address using their capacities and technical know-how, right? And that is where we come in as young people. But I think that young Africans have been volunteering for so many years and still continue to volunteer because young people start their own civil society organizations, young people start their non-governmental organizations, and young people join international charity organizations to go out on the field and ensure that we better our lives. It needs us to redirect those energies and then restructure the volunteer movement on the continent in an attempt to address specific objectives. But fair and large, I think that there's been a commendable army of young people out there volunteering to change our world.
Thank you. What is your greatest achievement outside of work?
What is my personal greatest achievement?
Yes, outside of work.
Outside of work. Well, let me say I'm a very passionate Pan-Africanist, and so anything that would inure to the benefit of the young people of Africa or create a situation whereby Africa wins is one that I'm extremely excited about. I think that one of the things that I'll attribute to be, and that's why it's very difficult for me to say outside work, because most of my time is spent on ensuring that I mobilize young people on the continent, and then we focus on doing specific things. But I think that my greatest achievement outside formal work is helping communities in Ghana and the vulnerable groups in Ghana to work toward achieving certain targets.
Thank you. Another question, what indicators of sustainable development are currently being used in Africa and what are being developed?
Let me say that if you want to measure development in Africa, I think that for me, the greatest measure of development in Africa is measuring how many young people go to bed with a meal. Right? Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yes.
that for me,
charger.
For me, the greatest indicator that I would use as a basis to say, look, we are making strides is how many young people would go to bed tomorrow having a good meal, and how many young people out there have a good job. So that's an indicator that I am looking forward to say that, look, the day that we wake up and young that, look, I have a job that puts me above the poverty line, and then we are no longer going to be talking about the massive youth unemployment and the extreme hunger and poverty, and we are not talking about the wars on the continent and how many people that die out of gunshots, how many people that die out of Ebola, out of malaria. This will be my kind of indicators to measure whether the sustainable development goals are actually working or not working. Because really, if you take most of the indicators that we look at, they are academic exercises and do not really address the real challenges that the young people of Africa are confronted with. And so these are because when poverty is reduced, automatically it cures 90% of all the SDG indicators. We can burn down his own house in the name of a war, because all these insecurities and then the conflicts across the continent are because of strive for natural resources and for better lives. So I'm reducing the question to specific points that, for me as a young African, would actually define the welfare and that we are actually achieving the SDGs.
Okay, very true and interesting. Thank you, Ahmed. Next question: how can poverty be reduced? What institutional roles can be played to support that?
Two things. Poverty can be reduced in Africa if the bigger one, policy, economic development policy in Africa is tailored to ensure that, one, we close the inequality gap, two, we create more opportunities for young people to be economically empowered, which includes the IMFs and the World Banks, and then the bigger multilateral corporations across the world stop exploiting us with a lot of support from the World Trade Organization. Now, because if you take mining, if you take cocoa production, if you take the oil and gas sector across the African continent, the reason a lot of young people are in poverty is because all these multinational organizations, when they come, they exploit and they have support from bigger countries or their countries of origin to twist even the governments to ensure that they are able to exploit these natural resources and take them at giveaways. Now we need to address that. The second thing, politicians in Africa have a responsibility to ensuring that citizens of their country, the interests of their citizens, are protected. And so if we do not eliminate corruption and we do not reduce graft, let me use that word, thievery, like broad daylight stealing by leaders on the continent, then clearly it will be extremely difficult, because the Thabo Mbeki report that was commissioned by the African Union indicated that over $1 billion a year, over $50 billion a year leaves Africa through illegal means, through corrupt means. Can you imagine what 50 billion would do for the African continent?
Yeah.
But where does the 50 billion go? To the United States, to Europe, to Asia, and to most of the countries out there. It means that if all these countries are willing to support the fight against corruption, they are willing to empower young Africans, then one would have eradicated unemployment and would have clawed back the 50 billion that go out through illicit routes into our health infrastructure, into our road, our telecommunication, into our educational infrastructure. The quality of education and the numbers of young people that get quality education defines the rates at which poverty is reduced. Because once you have the needed skills and technical know-how, what it means is that your livelihood is automatically going to improve. So these are the three things that I would mention. One, economic policy. Two, corruption. Three, education. And finally, all these countries out there that pretend to be holier than the African countries must stop encouraging and stop aiding and abetting corruption by hiding the proceeds of corruption in their countries. Because Africa do not have safe havens, tax havens. All these tax havens are in Switzerland, they are in Cayman Islands, and all the other countries that are Western countries. So if they are actually willing to help us fight corruption, let them stop all these illicit outflow of resources from both the corrupt politicians in Africa and the corrupt politicians and oligarchs out there in Europe and Americas.
Thank you. And do you, by the way, do you think that the UN is helpful in terms of poverty eradication in Africa?
I think that the UN will do what it's supposed to do, but the larger aspects of the UN's operation is dependent on the decisions of states. Because if countries make decisions and the decisions do not support the effort that the UNSF is putting in place, it comes to zero. The second thing is that the UNSF is being controlled by the countries that finance them. So even if you are talking about, like I come back to the issues again, you can talk about reduction of poverty when you're able to address corruption. You can talk about reduction of poverty when we talk about reduction in inequality and reduction in the exploitation of the natural resources of vulnerable countries. So because you know that Ghana is a country of 27 million, we have a lot of oil, we have a lot of gold and cocoa, but we do not have military power. And then you twist our leaders at the national level, the decisions of the UN become literally useless. So we are saying that, yes, the UN is doing what it's supposed to do, yes, but what has been the influence and contribution of countries, bigger countries that influence issues at the UN? Remember that if we even do an analysis of decisions of the UN Security Council against countries like Libya and so on and so forth, it actually goes to tell you that the UN itself probably do not have control over certain geopolitical decisions that are being made at its own backyard. But then certain countries have got enormous interest in how systems are run across the world, and they just put the UN in a bad situation. Like, for instance, you're looking at a situation whereby even in the face of Corona, the United States says that, look, I'm withdrawing my support for World Health Organization. What is the interest? How do you empower the UN to turn out credible data when you are cutting their funding? UN signs treaties of non-proliferation. Who are the countries that take the ammunitions? 200,000 tons of guns and ammunition in Libya, which is destabilizing Libya, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and countries in the Sahel. Once these countries are destabilized, poverty increases. So there are so many intertwined issues across the world that the UN has to confront. But then countries have a responsibility to agree that there are certain things that must stop, and in doing that would reduce poverty on the African continent and the rest of the world.
Okay, good answer. Thank you. Another question, how did the work of your organization change because of the coronavirus?
So automatically it affects what we do, reaching out to young people across the continent, mobilizing them, speaking to them, and getting them to understand that we need to move as one solid block as an African continent. So automatically, yes, it affects us. It also affects the activities of our member organizations like the National Youth Council, because youth development and mainstreaming has to do with also young people in rural areas. And that means traveling to them and the needed advocacy. And you cannot do community advocacy and community mobilization when you are locked down. So certainly it affects our member organizations, who then dovetails into the bigger continental framework. Somebody says who
I think
inspires me the most.
yeah.
I
Okay,
think
good
it's not
question. Who?
it's not about who inspires me the most. I think that what inspires me to do what I do is the history of the African continent, the 500 years of colonialism, the exploitation of the African people, the fact that Africa is a continent with over 35% of the most essential natural resources to develop the world, yet we are the poorest continent, is what inspires and motivates me to want to do what I do. The fact that Africa has been divided into francophone and anglophone lines when we do not have English people in Africa and we don't have French people in Africa, we just have Africans in Africa.
Good answer. But still, do you have a role model?
I draw a lot of inspiration because of the history of Russia and where he took over as the president of Russia and where he has taken Russia and his decisions that he has made in the global front. So I draw a lot of inspiration from his leadership style and how he has done his things. The second person that I draw a lot of inspiration from is the president of the Republic of Ghana, the current president of Ghana. Also because of where he started, his history, his tenacity, and his resilience that's taking him to contest elections 3 consecutive times and became president of the Republic of Ghana after a 4th try gives me hope. It tells me that as a young person, if you are determined, you commit to doing something, you'd certainly get there.
Okay, very interesting. I'm sure after this, our viewers will go and check who is this person, the president of Ghana, and they will want to learn more about his personality and his biography. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for joining us. Despite all the technical difficulties, you were able to break through and deliver all the messages, all the inspiration for young people of Russia and everybody else who joined us. We had a lot of different countries, Venezuela, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, many African representatives as well. It was a very good and inspiring talk. Thank you so much, Ahmed. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And if you still have any questions, please feel free to send them to us. And when we publish the article on our website, we will include the answers to the questions in writing. I hope that Ahmed will still be willing to answer some of the questions that we didn't touch today. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, everybody.